Michael Sobolik is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. He specializes in United States-China relations and great power competition with a focus on geopolitics, net assessments, and competitive strategies. He is the author of Countering China's Great Game, a strategy for American dominance. Here. He is also an advisory board member of Vandenberg Coalition and a contributing editor at Providence, a journal of Christianity and foreign policy. Prior to joining the Hudson, he served as a senior fellow in Indo-Pacific Studies at the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C., where he ran the council's Indo-Pacific Security Program. He previously served in the United States Senate as a legislative assistant to Senator Ted Cruz. His commentary has appeared in the Washington Post, Bloomberg, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, among others. He has also appeared on PBS, BBC, Fox News, and other outlets. He earned his master's in international affairs from the Bush School of Government and Public Service and a Bachelor of Science in Political Science at Texas A&M. Please begin.
Glenn, thank you so much for the invitation to address the forum. Looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much. I'll start my comments with recounting a meeting that I had in 2018 in the Senate when I was working for Ted Cruz. As Len mentioned, I was Senator Cruz's China hand for about 5 years, from 2014 to 2019. And as many of you know, most meetings that staffers take are forgettable. It's one interest group after another that has their own agenda. And it just becomes a part of being a staffer in Congress, is taking these meetings, jotting down what they care about, and then relaying that either to the member of Congress or to your direct supervisor. However, there were a small handful of meetings in my 5 years in the Senate that I will never forget. One of them was in 2018 when I sat down with the president of MD Anderson in Texas, MD Anderson being the globally renowned Cancer Research Institute. And normally the president of an organization like MD Anderson would be meeting with the healthcare staffer, but he didn't want to talk about healthcare and cancer specifically. He wanted to talk about national security. So I sat down with him and he said, we have a problem at our institution. We have roughly 53 different departments, and of those 53, 37 of them have scholars that are affiliated with China's Thousand Talents program. It's gotten notable press reporting over the past few years, the Thousand Talents program being one of the Chinese Communist Party's primary talent recruitment initiatives to get Western scholars, professors who have, in many cases, have labs associated with them and a lot of basic and applied research attached to their work and their funding, and to lure them and the research itself to China over time. And they will use significant monetary enticements to do that. And he said, we have all these Thousand Talents participants, and the one department I'm most worried about is the radiology department. The goal that we have assessed of the Chinese partners on the other end of this collection effort, it's not that they're out to find ways to cure cancer in China. They are interested in our radiology research at MD Anderson because they want to see if they can immunize mass populations of their own citizens to the effects of nuclear fallout in the event of a nuclear war with the United States. That was one of my, if you want to call it a come to Jesus moment, if you want to call it a scared straight moment, it was both of them for sure. And it painted in vivid and clear colors and terms for me what the Chinese Communist Party was seeking to do with the United States and the level to which they were willing to prosecute that effort. I think Senator Cruz, my old boss, has couched it in these terms. I have adopted this framing, as have several others. I believe the United States is in another Cold War today with the Chinese Communist Party. There is vociferous debate in Washington over whether that framing is correct and whether the assumptions that underpin it are correct as well. The two main points of contestation that I'll start talking about, and then once we talk a little bit about the US, I'll say a few words about China. But with America, I think we're in the middle of a big debate over two questions. The first one being, is the relationship between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party a positive sum relationship or a zero sum relationship when it comes to questions of national security? And the second set of questions would be, is the correct response to that for the United States to trim its commitments or to expand its capabilities to respond to that relationship with China? How you answer those two questions goes a long way to determining where you sit in this broader debate that is happening in China policy about whether America should pursue dominance or whether we should pursue a grand strategy of retrenching in certain parts of the world to focus more specifically on the China threat. When I wrote my book, Countering China's Great Game, that was published last year, I approached my analysis of the United States with a few bedrock assumptions. Number one, that our unipolar moment, to borrow Charles Krauthammer's characterization, that we had in the 90s was a enviable moment that any nation in history would love to have that level of unbridled, unrivaled power. It was also a fleeting moment. And I don't know that there are any inside of the Beltway, DC Beltway, who would make the case that America is stronger today relative to a near peer adversary than we were in the 90s. I think we maybe can all agree that we live in a very different world than we did then. But then the second assumption that I based that book on was America does not have the luxury of walking away from the world as we know it and expecting the world as we know it not to change. That's the commentary not only on the post-Cold War order, but I think also on the post-World War II world order, where the United States has emerged, for better or for worse, as the guarantor of security for our allies, for our partners, for global shipping, and is the bedrock of the status quo. And retrenching in one theater or another theater can easily have cascading implications. The final assumption of that book is that the United States is not going to have an easy road to matching China ship for ship, man for man, but that isn't necessarily a deal breaker with grand strategy, with achieving our objectives and blunting Beijing's objectives. The thrust of that book are examining Beijing's asymmetric weaknesses and America's asymmetric advantages, and figuring out how to move the US-China competition to more favorable terrain for Washington. The second half of the book goes into great detail about how to do that. If y'all are interested in tearing apart some of those details, happy to get into it in Q&A, but I want to stay at the wave tops, at least for now, because I think there's some other ground we should cover. Others in US foreign policy who argue for a position of retrenchment take a very different approach to those three assumptions. Maybe the first one they would agree on, that certainly we're not as powerful as we were in the 90s. But when it comes to shaving off commitments in one area to then focus in another, the case study of this most prominently is certainly with Ukraine. And the argument from folks like Elbridge Colby, who is now in the senior position in DoD for policy, is that the United States has no choice but to figure out a way to get the Europeans to care about their own security and to pony up their own national wealth, and maybe supranational wealth from an EU perspective, to make NATO bigger than just American strength, to make NATO a true transatlantic alliance, which I think everyone in Washington would agree with. But the fundamental calculus of people like Bridge and others in the second Trump administration is that we can find a way to disengage, not just disengage from the Ukraine conflict, but maybe even to rehabilitate Russia and not have a deterrent cost or a deterrent implication in the Indo-Pacific. This is not Bridges' position, I don't believe, but there are others, certainly on the far left and the far right of American politics, who make that same argument in the Middle East, with Israel specifically, that America's relationship with Israel is a capabilities drain and also political drain, because it distracts us and keeps us connected to this region that is, as some would say, hopelessly unstable. The United States, the longer it stays in the Middle East, the more it's going to be distracted from the competitions that matter the most. We need to find a way to disentangle ourselves. So with Eastern Europe and with the Middle East in particular, there's an emerging discourse in the United States and serious foreign policy circles that we need to fundamentally find ways to get out of that game so we can focus where it matters the most in the Indo-Pacific with China. The trade-off here is one that if I were not an American, I would not envy the United States, because this is a very difficult choice that we have right now, and there are no easy answers. And I think that, to me, is one of the most frustrating elements of this whole conversation, is that you have talking heads on either side of this debate who will, of course, as we are wont to do, straw man the other position. But really, both sides of this debate are partially correct. The United States is a far cry from where we were in 1991. And also, we remain a global leader and a global power with global interests. If we were to disengage from Ukraine or from Europe or from the Middle East, that would address some real resource constraints. The military assistance we have been giving to Ukraine, and also our campaign against the Houthis in the Red Sea, like, this is having an impact on our missile, on like our missile reserves. Every Tomahawk we fire is one less that we have for a Taiwan contingency or something in the South China Sea. So that is inarguably correct. The other side of that is also true, that there's perhaps been no more louder proponent of America helping Ukraine than Taiwan. And as they would put it, Ukraine's security is Taiwan's security, because not only is Xi Jinping watching Putin's fate in Ukraine to compare his own, the strength of the People's Liberation Army compared to Russia's military, he is watching Washington's response against Putin to try to assess as best he can how Washington would respond if he were to make a move on Taiwan. And that is equally true, that we have a resource problem, but we also have a credibility problem. And America is in a position, I think, where we need to pick our poison. Do we want to trim our commitments and retain potentially some significant credibility risk and risk to the weakening of deterrence, and hope that we can execute that maneuver without tilting the Taiwan Strait or the Indo-Pacific even closer into war than it already is? Or do we risk running up our defense spending in a way where it will be impossible to cut taxes simultaneously while we do so, and while we are also paying more to service our own debt than we are to service our national security? These are very difficult questions with no easy answers that I see. I wrote Countering China's Great Game to try to illuminate this opportunity for policymakers to think a little more creatively. There might be a third option, and that third option is to take account for China. And I'll say a few brief remarks about China right now. It is very impressive what the Chinese Communist Party has been able to do since Mao established the PRC in 1949, and certainly since Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms in the late 70s have blossomed into China being the juggernaut that it is today. Certainly with American help with permanent normal trade relations and joining the WTO. But we should give the CCP its due credit. They're one of the most flexible, resilient political organizations in our lifetime. Flexible ideologically, while also retaining a bedrock commitment to Marxist-Leninism with Chinese characteristics, and that has varied from Mao to Xi, to be sure. But the CCP has accomplished a lot. At the same time, I think it is easy for Americans and for maybe Western audiences to look at the CCP and to see how far the People's Republic of China has come, and to have this admiration and this awe for the capability and the capacity of the Chinese state to execute the kind of power that it does. Like one of the buzzwords in Washington right now is transnational repression, how the CCP is able to have this long-arm jurisdiction to set up illegal police stations inside of the United States to track, surveil, and intimidate human rights activists of Chinese ethnic descent. To do that even more brazenly in Europe than they do in America, and to our north in Canada, to look at how they leverage technology to surveil and censor globally, but certainly within their own borders, with speed and alacrity and with precision. It's impressive that they can do that, but it is really unimpressive that they feel the need to do it in the first place. It's easy for us to forget a fundamental reality that was true of the Soviets and is true of the CCP today. This is a brittle regime with a fundamental fear of its own people. Moreover, it is a regime that has inherited a strategic culture that is infused with imperialism. And this was another contribution that I endeavored to make when I wrote the book, because in Washington, at least, I will speak as someone who lives and breathes the Beltway era, which is not a good thing. China is almost exclusively talked about as an ideological threat in Washington, which I do believe it is. It's also discussed as an economic threat, which of course it is that too. But a lot of policymakers, I think, in DC underappreciate that the CCP is also an imperialist colonial actor. And this is not really unique to the CCP. It has inherited that strategic culture from China's dynastic era. One of the biggest mistakes we make is starting our evaluation of China in 1949. The PRC is even younger than America is. And America is a very young nation, but China as an entity is ancient. And that's great for us because in great power competition, you need data about your adversary. And lucky for America, we have more data on China than China has on us. That's not to say that the CCP is exactly copy-paste identical to the dynasties that came before it. There are key differences, and Mao even went out of his way to try to put to death a lot of China's ancient history with Confucianism, as many of us know. But you can't so easily erase your heritage. You cannot so easily erase your own strategic history that has brought you to where you are. And as I studied China's Belt and Road Initiative and literally mapped it over China's imperial expansion from the Qin dynasty in 221 BC to the final Qing dynasty, which collapsed around 1912 AD, the pattern is eerie, and the similarity is eerie. China, because of its geographic endowment, has had a rough time, very unlike America, which has had an awesome geographic endowment. But China has shared, even from antiquity, has shared borders with many neighbors on all sides. And it was able to flourish economically because it was sandwiched amongst rivers, and it was in this very favorable terrain. But China expanded in its early days partially because it needed defensible borders. But then you also had a very, maybe a rightly proud ideology with, not just with Confucianism, but with this belief that the emperor is the son of heaven, that China is the middle kingdom, the Zhongguo, and that the son of heaven should rightly rule over Tianxia, all under heaven. And this ideology over time, combined with its geographic challenges, There's a reason China expanded by a factor of 4 from its first dynasty to its final dynasty. And that is the story about China that I tell in the book, and that I'm trying to convince policymakers in DC to recognize. Because if you really are an imperialist power, that comes with some vulnerabilities and some disadvantages, not just with how you are prone to overexpansion and overstretch, but also how those costs are borne by your own people. So I conclude the book with some specific ways that America can start tinkering and exploiting the weaknesses of the Belt and Road Initiative and China's foreign policy, not just because it's good to exploit the weaknesses of your adversary, but for this broader objective. We need to distract Beijing from its outward-facing aggression and preoccupy it with problems inside of its own borders. And that's will not be difficult to do because the party has plenty. There's a lot of levers we haven't pulled for a lot of reasons, but we have not pulled them. So again, I'm much more interested in the conversation we have than I am of continuing to drone on. So I'm going to end on that final note and kind of leave that hanging. If we want to get into some of the specific competitive strategies, I would love to. If we want to get into the debate between retrenchment and dominance, I would be curious to hear where everyone in the group sits and how you think through that debate as well. But I do believe that if America ignores the asymmetric competition, we are going to make an already difficult decision for the president and for his advisors even more difficult than it needs to be. And I'll stop there.